Hello, this is Aaron Mandel. I am the Director of Education for the American Wine Society. Welcome to Bordeaux, the region and its wines. This is going to provide an elementary education regarding Bordeaux, some of the subregions, as well as the wines that are made in the Bordeaux region. Bordeaux is located in the southwest of France, about 312 miles from Paris. Many times when you go to a wine region, people will tell you that their wine region is at the same latitude as Burgundy or the same latitude as Bordeaux. And that's why I included this slide, because you can see from this that Bordeaux is at a latitude actually north of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Latitude may tell you the number of hours of daylight that you're going to get at a given time of year, but it does not really tell you the whole picture about why a given region is good for growing grapes. So why can they grow wine in the Bordeaux region if it's so far north? Well, on this map you can see that there are several large bodies of water that are near the Bordeaux region. You start with the Gironde estuary, which is a very large body of water where the Dordogne and Garonne River come together before it goes into the Atlantic Ocean. And then you have the Dordogne River, and then you have the Garonne River. And these large bodies of water help moderate the climate in the Bordeaux wine region. Here is a picture of the Garonne River taken at Bordeaux. And this was taken because I wanted people to be able to see that this was a very large river. You can see here, taken from Bordeaux over to the other side of the river, that this is a large body of water and it's going to really help moderate the climate in the Bordeaux region. The Gironde is the same kind of thing. This is an estuary, and this is more like a lake than it is like a river. I mean, you can look at this and see that it's a huge body of water. This is actually taken from Chateau Montrose in Saint-Estèphe, and so this is right near that winery, and you can see just how much this is going to moderate the climate by that winery. Now, Bordeaux is also close to the Atlantic Ocean. So you have a lot of climate moderation from the Gulf Stream. And if you look at this picture, you'll also see that to the left of the Gironde estuary, you have a lot of forest there. And that's the lawn forest. The lawn forest was originally not there. Originally, this was an area of a lot of marshes. You had ponds, you had lakes. And that was an area that was just not really habitable. The forests were planted in there in order to help maintain the land so that you didn't have so much erosion, and also to provide a livelihood for people, because you're going to have pines they're going to be able to use for an industry. And with the planting of the pines, you ended up not only having an industry that grew there, but also the trees blocked the winds from the Atlantic. So you get less of the wind coming from the Atlantic into the Bordeaux region. And while they were growing great wines in the Bordeaux before the lawns were planted in the early 1800s, the planting of the forest helped moderate the climate enough that now they had a more stable environment, and it was more consistent that they were able to ripen the grapes there. When most people think about Bordeaux, they think about the first growth and the second growths, etc., such as Latour and Lafite or Lacasse. And this map shows you just how many different wine growing regions there are in Bordeaux. In 2016, they're going to produce about 770 million bottles of wine in Bordeaux, and most of these are not going to be in these great classifications. A lot of them are going to be very well worth drinking, and I encourage you to try them. But for purposes of this is more like an elementary education into Bordeaux. We're going to concentrate on a few regions, and these are going to be the Médoc, the Libournais, the Graves, and the Entre-deux-Mers, and Sauternes. Now, before we get into the regions, we have to talk about the Appellation d'origine contrôlée. AOCs are granted by the government, and they're based on certain geographical indications. And it's nice to think about them like Russian nesting dolls. You have the very small regions, such as Margaux. And Margaux has very, very strict rules and regulations. It's not like Napa where you can go in there and technically you could plant Concord and sell that as a Napa Valley wine. In Bordeaux, in Margaux, if you want to make a wine and label it with Margaux, it has to be a red wine. It has to be made from certain grapes. It has to be pruned in a certain fashion. Everything has to be done according to certain regulations. Now, if you don't want to label it as Margaux, you could label it as Haut-Médoc. Haut-Médoc will have slightly less stringent rules and regulations. If you want to plant a white wine in Margaux, well, you can't call it Margaux because it's not a red, but you can label it as a higher AOC, like Bordeaux. A Bordeaux AC can be a white wine, but the same grapes grown on the same plot in the same region can't be called a Margaux if it's a white wine because the subregion doesn't allow that. So think of this like the Russian nesting dolls. You have the small regions with very strict rules, a little larger region with less stringent rules, and another region that has even less stringent rules. You're going to still have some very stringent rules for AOC designations, but as you get smaller and smaller, the rules get more and more strict. Now we're going to start talking about the big region, Bordeaux AC. The Bordeaux AOC covers the entire region, and wines can come from anywhere within these. Some of these wines are exceptional, but they fall outside the specific AOC for a subregion in which they're grown, so they can't be labeled that. Common classification for that is the Pavilion Blanc from Chateau Margaux. It is made in Margaux. The white grapes are grown on Margaux, but you cannot put that they're made in Margaux on the label because it doesn't fit within the rules of Margaux. The Haut-Médoc is a subregion of the Médoc. It is slightly smaller and it has slightly more stringent rules than Bordeaux AC. But then within the Haut-Médoc, you have some of the finest wine growing regions. You have Pauillac, Saint-Estèphe, Saint-Julien, and Margaux. And these are all within the Haut-Médoc, and they each have their own separate AOC. And those rules are even stricter. A few years ago, I was at a tasting, and it was being put on by some wholesalers. And they were talking about some wines from Pauillac and saying how they were from the right bank. Keeping the left bank and the right bank straight is actually very simple. You take a look at this map here. You can see the Gironde estuary. Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux, Haut-Médoc, they're all on the left side of the estuary. And all of those are in the left bank of Bordeaux. If you want to plant grapes on the left bank, you can plant whites or reds. But if you want to label it with Haut-Médoc or one of the subregions, it has to be a red wine. Most of the wines from the left bank are going to consist primarily of Cabernet Sauvignon, with a large amount of Merlot and a little bit of Cabernet Franc. Petit Bordeaux is being added, and actually the amount of Petit Bordeaux is getting to be more and more recently. And Malbec is allowed, but you're not seeing as much of it in the blends as you did at one time. Some of the world's greatest red wines come from the four subregions of Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, and Margaux. And you can see those here on this map and where they are in relation to the Gironde estuary. The area of the Haut-Médoc was originally salt marsh and swamp. Not good for growing grapes. But the Dutch were getting a lot of grapes and wines from the Graves region, which is where, at the time, all the great wines of Bordeaux were coming from. And they needed better ways to get these wines out of there. So they did what the Dutch are very good at. They drained the swamps, they drained the salt marshes, and that left the area that we now have as the Haut-Médoc. And if you tour the area today, you can still see some areas where there are dams or where there are drainage areas to help keep the water out of the area. So what do you get when you drain a swamp on the border of a river? Well, you get a soil with a lot of rock. and the soil on the left bank is very heavy with gravel. Bordeaux gets about 40 inches of rain a year. It's a maritime climate, and when you get that much rain, if you want to ripen something like Cabernet Sauvignon, you're going to need to have good draining soils. And with the gravel in the soils on the left bank, you end up having some good drainage. Now, in addition, rocks also heat up and will hold the heat well. So if you look here at La Faune Rocher, you can see that the vines are trained low. And the reason they're trained low is because they want to get some of the warmth from the gravel that is in the soil that's heated up during the course of the daytime. That helps ripen the Cabernet. So with the proximity to the Atlantic, so that you have moderation of temperature, and the stone soil is providing you with good drainage and stones that heat up, Cabernet Sauvignon, which is a late ripening grape variety, can ripen on the left bank. Because of this, you have a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon on the left bank wines. When you get a left bank Bordeaux and you taste that, you're going to get some of the characteristics of Cabernet Sauvignon, which means that you're going to have lots of tannins, you're going to have some good acidity. But Cabernet Sauvignon, if you know anything about its history, it's the child of Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc. Because of that, it retains some of the pyrazines. Pyrazines will give the grape some green pepper flavors, and it's not unusual to have some green pepper aromatics and flavors in a Bordeaux Cabernet Sauvignon. You're also, of course, going to have some dark fruit like plums and black cherries. You also get some earthy characteristics in a left bank Bordeaux. And these are going to all be well balanced with the tannins and the acidity, and it's going to be a very mouth-filling, complex red wine. Now, on the right bank of the Gironde and the Dordogne is the right bank. Very creative, huh? This is the Libournais, the right bank of Bordeaux. When you hear right bank, we're referring usually to Pomerol and Saint-Emilion, but you can see there are lots of small satellite areas here. There's the Landes de Pomerol, Luzac, and these all produce wines, very good wines as well. But mostly when the people talk about the right bank, they're talking about Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. The soils in the Libournais are primarily clay. That is not to say that there is no gravel on the right bank. There are a few areas on the right bank that have gravel, and they plant some Cabernet Sauvignon on the right bank. But for the most part, you have different types of clay, and if you think about gardening, if it's 95 degrees outside and you're digging a hole, which means that you're pretty miserable because it's 95 and you're digging a hole, but if you're digging in clay, the clay is still cool, and that's because clay holds water very well, and that makes the clay cool. Well, clay not being as well draining and being cool is not as good for Cabernet Sauvignon. So because you have this lack of gravel soils in the Libournais, we don't really have good Cabernet Sauvignon ripening like you do on the left bank. So what we have are primary grape varieties on the right bank of Merlot and Cabernet Franc. I included this slide just because there are some people that are going to be talking about sideways and how they ridicule Merlot there. Some of the most sought after wines of the world are from the Libournais. Petros is usually 100% Merlot. Chateau Cheval Blanc is a vast majority Merlot. These are some of the most expensive and sought after wines there are. Each of them sell for thousands of dollars a bottle. Red wines from the right bank, they are Merlot heavy. Sometimes you might have a majority Cabernet Franc, but normally it's mostly Merlot. These wines have a lot of red fruits in them, red cherries, raspberries. You also have some earthy characteristics and a little bit of tobacco or forest floor characteristics. They tend to be about 13.5% alcohol, which is not high, but might be a little higher than you have on the left bank. And these wines are, again, just great wines for drinking. Now the Graves is to the south of the Medoc on the left bank. It's well known for both dry white wines and some great dry reds, also for some spectacular sweet wines. Really, they grow and produce everything in Graves. Now the white wines can be made anywhere in Bordeaux, and I talked before about the laws in place where white wines cannot be labeled with some ACs, often labeled as generic AC Bordeaux. So you'll see a lot of wines from the Graves that just say AC Bordeaux. Some wines, I mentioned earlier, Pavillon Blanc from Chateau Margaux, that is actually made and produced in Margaux. The grapes are on Chateau Margaux's property, but it cannot bear the AC Margaux on its label because it is a white wine. So the Graves has the left bank gravel soils, but you have less influence from the rivers, less temperature moderation. Cabernet Sauvignon still ripens there very well. Chateau Aubryon is in Graves. It's now in the Pessac, which was only created as a separate region in 1987, but that was Graves when the 1855 classification came out. So we can get great red wines from Graves, but really what we're focusing here on are the whites. When you see a dry white from Bordeaux, you're generally talking about wines made from Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, and a little bit of Muscadel. Sauvignon Blanc is going to give you a citrusy and grassy characteristic to the wine. Semillon is going to be blended in. It's going to give it a little bit more body, a little texture, and you're going to get a little honey characteristic, maybe like a honeysuckle. And then Muscadel, a little bit will be added, if any at all, to add a touch of grapiness to the wine. Most of the wines are not going to be aged in oak, but some of them will be fermented in oak or aged in oak for a very brief time. The white wines from Graves or from Bordeaux generally are fantastic white wines, and they should not be overlooked. Earlier we talked about how wines that are going to bear the label Au Medoc or Margaux have to be red wines. Entre de Mer has to be a white wine. So if it says Entre de Mer, it has to be a white wine if it's an AC wine. Entre de Mer means between two seas, and that's exactly what we have for this property. It's between two rivers. White wines here might be made from a single grape variety, but the vast majority of them are going to be Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, and maybe a little bit of Muscadel. When you get to the south of Graves, you get to the regions of Sauternes and Barsac. These are where some of the greatest sweet wines in the world are produced. We talked about the lawn forest earlier when we were talking about the Atlantic influence. Well, the lawn forest also has an influence here. The Saronne River flows through the lawn forest. It's largely shaded. That makes the Saronne River cooler than the Garonne. So the Saronne flows up into the Garonne. The Garonne is warmer, you get the cool water and the warm water combining, and that produces some fog and increased humidity. When you have this mist and you have dry afternoons, you end up with some noble rot on the grapes, botrytis. The rot ends up drying out the grapes themselves, taking a lot of the moisture out. It also causes some chemical reactions, and you end up with this very high sugar nectar, which makes beautiful wines. You can look at this picture and see the botrytis. whoever first ate one of those grapes or made a wine out of those grapes has more nerve than I, because they just don't look tasty. But I guess that if your entire livelihood depends upon these grapes, sometime you're going to say, let's see what happens. What's the worst that can happen? We're going to put the effort forth and we're going to get nothing out of it. And then you end up with these delicious wines and everybody ends up copying you. Now, Sauternes wines are made primarily from Semillon because it has thin skins and it's very susceptible to botrytis. With these really sweet wines, you add some Sauvignon Blanc because it adds a balancing acidity. You may also add a little Muscadel. Here we have a bottle from Chateau Côté, and you can see that while this is made in Barsac, Barsac is allowed to add Sauternes to its label. So wines from Barsac may say Sauternes Barsac on them. Sauternes are very sweet dessert wines. A lot of times people will buy these large 750 milliliter bottles of a Sauternes to share with a spouse or loved one. And this is some very sweet wine. It's very rich. So you're not normally pouring 5 or 6 ounce pours of these wines. Normally, I'm pouring 2 ounces, 3 ounces tops. So most of the time, if you're having it with just one person or even 4, you might only need a 375 milliliter bottle. These are some great wines, but they are extraordinarily rich. They have flavors of pineapple and honey, apricot and marmalade. The Côté on the prior slide, I always get a lot of pineapple out of that wine. Roussec here, always a lot of apricot and orange marmalade. But these are just some stupendous wines. I mentioned earlier the classifications, and the one that everybody recognizes is the 1855 classification, which has your first growths, your second growths, your third growths, etc. And not surprisingly, this was done in 1855. And at the time, the only ones that were listed in the classification were the wineries from the Medoc, except for Haut-Brion. Haut-Brion at the time was probably the most famous winery in the region, so you couldn't leave them out. But other than Haut-Brion, all the wineries here are from the Medoc. Now, Saint-Emilion, Sauternes, Grave, they all have their own classifications. There are additional classifications that are utilized in Bordeaux. That's going to have to wait for a future presentation. But for the 1855 classification, here it is here. Mouton Rothschild was added in 1976, and one other winery, Cantemerle, was added a few months after the initial publication of the 1855 classification. But otherwise, all these wineries are exactly as they were in 1855. And that is it for our presentation of Bordeaux. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you go out and you try some of these wines from Bordeaux. Don't just buy the ones that the critics like. There are a lot of very good wines being made in the Bordeaux region. A lot of them the critics never taste, and a lot of them are quite affordable. So please go out, be adventurous, try some different wines, and I think you'll find some wines that you really will enjoy. Until next time, I'm Aaron Mandel. Thank you very much.